The only way it could not have been his war would have been had he stood there on the day after his inauguration or signed an executive order or something and made it clear that we were going to cease sending all forms of military aid to Ukraine.
Well, recently, Douglas Macgregor went on Judging Freedom, that's Andrew Napolitano's podcast, and talked about the course of the war in Ukraine and where it's been going, and why Trump deserves some culpability now for his time in office and how he's treated Ukraine. I think this is really interesting, especially given Macgregor's expertise, so let's watch and let's react.
On his way back from his home in Florida on Sunday night on Air Force One, the president spoke at length. We've reduced it to 60 seconds. I'm going to tell you ahead of time what I'm going to ask you. Is the war in Ukraine now Donald Trump's war? But before you answer, here's what he had to say about it. Cut number one.
Do you have a reaction to Russia's Palm Sunday attack on Ukraine?
I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake. But I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing. I think the war is, for that war to have started, is an abuse of power.
You said they made you were told they made a mistake. Do you mean it was unintentional?
They made a mistake. I believe it was. Look, you're going to ask them. This is Biden's war. This is not my war. I've been here for a very short period of time. This is a war that was under Biden. He gave him billions and billions of dollars. He should have never allowed, if he had any brain, which he didn't have and doesn't have, and now it's being proven, he wouldn't have allowed that war to start. I would have absolutely not. That war would never have taken place. But remember this is Biden's war. I'm just trying to get it stopped so that we can save a lot of lives. They happen to be Ukrainian and Russian lives. But all I want to do is get it stopped.
All right, before we hear from Macgregor here, most of what Trump said is accurate, but he leaves out some pretty important details there. And one of them is that Trump initially, his instincts were good on this, withheld about a $400 million shipment of military aid and equipment to Ukraine in 2019. And basically his opponents said, if you don't send this, you're essentially a Russian collusionist, treasonist. And, he basically was impeached over that ordeal, and he still sent the aid in the end anyways. So he basically got impeached for something that he was doing in regard to having the right instincts and withholding it, but he still got impeached over it. Trump sent that, and he still boasted, even recently, about how it included the anti-tank javelins. Also, Trump has the ultimate ammo in his belt on this, and that's that the U.S. participated in the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014, but he never brings that up. He acts like the war started in 2022.
So the legislation under which President Biden shipped about 165 to 190, it's hard to put a finger on it. There are different ways to measure it, as you know, billion in military equipment and cash to Kyiv, and under which President Trump has shipped $1 billion in military equipment to Kyiv, specifies that equipment is to be shipped at the discretion of the president. Question, is this now Donald Trump's war?
Yes. The only way it could not have been his war would have been had he stood there on the day after his inauguration or signed an executive order or something and made it clear that we were going to cease sending all forms of military aid to Ukraine, number one. And number two, that all U.S. personnel in and out of uniform, intelligence, civilian, doesn't make any difference, would leave Ukraine within 48 hours. Had he done that, then this would not be his war, but he did the opposite. And effectively, what he's done since he's been in there is largely extend Biden policies. So now he owns it. He knows how to stop it, and that's just what I described. But, this has always been a problem for him because he surrounds himself with people who give him reasons to act against his wisdom, against his own instincts. Let me tell you, back in April of 2022, I received a call from Mar-a-Lago, and a voice at the other end said, "What do you think about Ukraine and what's happening there?" This was probably the first week of April 2022. I said, "Well, this thing's a catastrophe. We need to stop it immediately." He said, "Why?" This particular voice. I said, "Well, if we don't stop it, the Russians are going to crush the Ukrainians." And the voice at the other end said, "Well, everyone here says that the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are losing." And I said, "Well, first of all, that's wrong. It's not true. And then secondly, we have no interest in a war in that region. What we have an interest in is peace and stability. And whatever we can do to bring peace and stability to the region should be our top priority, because otherwise we have no stake in Eastern Ukraine whatsoever." So I think you've always had people like Gorka, like Waltz. I mean, they may have other names. It doesn't make any difference. They surround the president and they try to persuade him that nothing can happen unless we are somehow or another directly involved in it, even though it may have no value strategically to us at all. And secondly, that we have to impose a solution, because if we don't, we look weak.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Colonel Macgregor here more. I actually tend to agree with him much more than I've heard John Mearsheimer talk about this recently in the war in Ukraine. But he is so right. We're back to status quo Biden-era policy of just funneling money in without any tangible dividends paid to the American citizen in getting out of this thing. This is the man that campaigned on being able to end this war within 24 hours. And hey, that's not all on him if you can't solve a war between two major powers within 24 hours, but you can, as president, withdraw all U.S. military support and all of U.S. military presence and resources and intelligence. But instead of doing that, even with the political capital he had after Zelensky went into the Oval Office and act like he basically owned the treasury and was entitled to it, Trump restricted the payments to Ukraine for a matter of days, only to resume them a few days later. And neocon Marco Rubio seemed to be, ecstatic about this. Some people thought that this was just a ruse to keep funding going back to Ukraine, and that ultimately is how it's kind of turned out. So I think Macgregor is totally right here. Trump has had good instincts on ending the war in Ukraine, but I don't know what it is. The military-industrial complex, the neocons around him, especially Rubio and Waltz, have drawn the U.S. back into this war in ways that reflects exactly what Biden was doing. It's pathetic.
And this is back to the question of how do we get a win for the boss? Well, wait a minute. This is not UFC night. This is not a college basketball match. This is life and death for millions of people at the moment in Ukraine. But if we're not careful, this could spread, not because of anything that President Putin wants to do, but because of the stupids who are ruling in Paris and London and Berlin. They could cause it to expand. And of course, that would be delightful for the fools living in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all of whom could be crushed in 24 hours. All of this nonsense needs to end. He's the leader of NATO. He commands NATO effectively. So he's the one that stands up and says, it's over. We're out. I'm not supporting this any longer. And as soon as you do that, everything changes. Zelensky's out of a job. Zelensky has no future. His corrupt criminal regime in a country that is potentially the most corrupt in the world, if such a thing is possible, will go under. This is why he owns it now. It's tragic. It's unnecessary, because it's right. He didn't want this, but he's not stopping it.
Exactly right. If you want a peace in Ukraine, the Ukrainians and the Europeans would be forced to create a peace with Russia if the U.S. withdraws its resources. The U.S. is bankrolling this. And yeah, a lot of the money is getting skimmed off to the war contractors and the military-industrial complex and all sorts of other, agencies, some of which were exposed under U.S. aid, and how the Maidan coup was funded by the tune of $100 million. But if that happens, there's no choice for Ukraine or Zelensky than for there to be a peace. Putin has made overtures that he wants this thing essentially settled. They're in basically the driver's seat positioning wise, having held the Donbass region, essentially the provinces in the Donbass, which they're not going to give up. And Zelensky's left with coming up with crazy fake Chinese soldier schemes to try to keep the money flowing, even though the money is still flowing. Despite all the theatrics, right now we have status quo. That won't change until Trump gets away from this, potential ceasefire idea or mineral deal. It will go away, and the U.S. will go back to a non-interventionist, pleasant standpoint when we just withdraw all of our support from Ukraine. Macgregor was right about this from day one. That is the only solution. Trump was right when his instincts said that was the right solution.
But Colonel, President Trump's official emissary to Ukraine, General Kellogg, actually proposed a solution. I mean, this is insane, but this is what he proposed. And the solution is to divide Ukraine up the way Berlin was right after 1945. Has he been living under a rock for the past 3 years? Does he think that such a solution would even be considered for a millisecond by Foreign Minister Lavrov or with whomever Mr. Witkoff is negotiating?
Well, I don't think General Kellogg's audience is in Moscow. I think his audience is in Western Europe, the three capitals that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
And he's got a big audience back here in Washington, D.C. These are foolish people that think that somehow or another we and the world and Europe will all benefit from sustaining this conflict. And there's just no evidence for that. The conflict is destructive.
Yeah, despite all the rhetoric of Keir Starmer and Macron and van der Leyen that, hey, we stick with Ukraine, we can fight this thing on, they're not putting their money where their mouth is because they can talk big like that, but it's the U.S. funding it. And that's why I think Trump has wisely mostly ignored the European voices, but is still making mistakes here.
It's harming everyone. It's harmed us economically as well as strategically. Stop and consider that we've learned a couple of very important things over the last few years. Number one, that our equipment, our organization, our tactics don't work on the battlefield that exists today. We live in a different world. We have a battlefield, or a battle space, as people like to call it, that has changed dramatically. The Russians have adapted. We haven't. And the genius military leaders that are currently occupying the senior echelons of the U.S. Armed Forces have played a dramatic role deciding how operations will be conducted. And as a result, 1.5 million Ukrainians, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers are dead. And the war has been lost. And the Russians are now prepared to move further west, consolidate their position before they finally put an end to this. So that's catastrophe number one, but we're not coming to terms with that reality. If we looked objectively at the battle space and understood what's happened militarily, we'd figure out pretty damn quick we're not in a position to do business effectively on the battlefield with the Russians. Number two, look at the tariffs. The tariffs have revealed something, our weakness economically. We went into this tariff war on the basis of the assumption of people like Navarro and presumably Lutnick that foreign capital would then flow into our markets. It's not flowing in. The bond market is a disaster. Right. If we're not careful, it's going to hit 5%. When that happens, we lose everything because the Japanese and the Chinese and others are dumping our treasuries. All of this is going on, and yet President Trump continues to vacillate between I want peace, but I'm going to continue to pretend to do these other things or do these other things because I'm supposed to look strong. This is sheer lunacy.
Yeah, I have to agree with Macgregor here. I can't speak to the numbers of the losses in the war on the Ukrainian side. I've seen numbers kind of all over the place. Some people do believe that 1 million Ukrainians have died in this thing, but he's so right about how Trump has vacillated between wanting to end this war and doing things to kind of keep it going and maintain it. And as Macgregor put it, look tough. That's a mistake. The best course is non-interventionism. That's America first. That it was what Trump's instincts correctly led him to before being steered to any of this.
China makes almost 50% of the ingredients that go into every antibiotic sold in the United States. The F-35, I'm reading from today's Financial Times. The F-35, the backbone of the U.S. Air Force, requires rare earth components only from China. And China owns close to close to $1 trillion of United States bonds.
Yep.
Didn't anybody point these things out to him before he imposed a 145% tariff on all goods coming in from China?
Look, a lot of people don't like Musk, but I think Musk made some rather unkind remarks about Mr. Navarro. And again, I go back to the statement that came from someone, I can't remember the name of the gentleman, that hire clowns, you get a circus. I mean, it doesn't look to me like anybody's done their homework at all. Everything is done impulsively. Everyone's flying from the seat of their pants, most of all the president. And the president needs to surround himself with better, more capable, more cautious people who are going to study these things. Again, the lesson of history is you always measure what you might gain by what you might lose before you do anything, most of all in a war. And most of the time, it makes no sense to turn to the military option, because once you do, everything is out of your control. You can't contain these things. You don't know where things will go next. And yet you have foolish people left and right who want to bomb things. I mean, how many times have we talked about the strategic realities that currently induce the Russians to support Iran? People don't understand that if you're a Russian, you look south, you look into Iran, you look towards the Caucasus, you want friendly states down there. You want peace down there, because that's the soft underbelly of Russia. That's as important to them as Mexico is to us.
Right.
And right now, they're worried that we're going to try and destroy the Iranian regime for Mr. Netanyahu. It's not enough. Remember, Mr. Netanyahu wants the Libyan solution for Iran. And replacing that government with what? Anything that could be hostile to Russia, presumably.
Russia learned some lessons based on the U.S. involvement in Syria and the U.S.'s attempt to enact a regime change there a decade prior to when it finally culminated earlier this year. Or was it late last year? I can't remember. But Russia was, looking at that area of the world to see, how the U.S. is going to respond to this. And now it's looking at Ukraine that way, when people in the U.S. government and the neocons are rattling sabers for a regime change there, like Israel has wanted for decades. It believes that stakes are as high as they've ever been.
And that's the last thing in the world the Russians want. They want to protect their southern borders. They want peace and stability down there. Look, this is just too dumb to repeat over and over and over again. But there is no strategic thinking in Washington. Everything is arrogance and ignorance on steroids.
You mentioned Senator McCain a few minutes ago. My friend Tom Woods was a big fan of yours. Once said, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain.
I guess it's because a lot of Americans are easily impressed with people who are loud and bloviate threats. I don't know how else to explain it. I mean, there's always been in the United States a certain number of people that I think belong to what I call the bombs away club. And they think if we're dropping bombs on somebody somewhere, that our greatness as a nation somehow or another is expressed. When in reality, you and I know that's not the case. What we should want is what we had before the Second World War. And that was a reputation in the world for fairness and decency. As after World War I ended and the Versailles Treaty was underway, believe it or not, the delegation of Arabs from Syria wanted the United States to provide forces to come there and administer their country. They didn't want the British or the French. And the reason for that was very simple. We were not colonialists. We were not imperialists.
And that has changed. That is sure the truth. But Tom Woods was totally right. No matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. But I don't think, like Macgregor says, it's just because of, the bombatism or the cult of personality around Trump. I think it's because of how entrenched this military-industrial complex, the bureaucratic class, the intelligence services that clamor for regime change and do everything imaginable to enact them throughout the world. those things are to blame too. Those are dynamics that are showing the continuity of American foreign policy regardless of who you elect. Not that Macgregor's totally wrong there either.
And they viewed us as fair and just people. Well, I don't think the people of Syria or anywhere else in the Muslim world would want Americans on their soil ever, based upon what we've seen over the last 30 years. Do you?
No, fully agreed, Colonel. Colonel, thank you for your time. Thanks for accommodating my schedule today. We missed you last week, but it's such a joy to be able to pick your brain again. All the best to you.
Hey, Judge, I have one last thing to point out to people. You know, in 1914, when war broke out, the British and the French ambassadors met immediately. And they both said the same thing to each other. The one person in Berlin who is most unhappy about this war is the Kaiser, because we all know war was the last thing he wanted. This is something he never wanted. Well, the rest of the story is very simple. He always had it within his power to stop it quickly, decisively, before it ever began, and he didn't do it. His chief of staff asked him on the eve of the German offensive into Belgium, or the Kaiser asked him, General, can I stop this? Well, the answer to that was yes. He was the supreme warlord. But the general said, no, Your Majesty, I don't think we can stop it. Well, that's ridiculous. And that's what President Trump needs to think about, because effectively right now, he's in a similar position. He is more than just the run-of-the-mill president. He is standing on the threshold of potential disaster. He can stop it. All he has to say is, no, it's over. Stop.
Yeah, couldn't agree with Macgregor more on that point. The chief solution is to withdraw U.S. support for Ukraine. That is what will force a peace. None of this dilly-dallying with ceasefires where the Russians won't accept them unless it's the same terms that they would use to accept a peace anyways. So Trump really wants this on his legacy, that he's going to be the one to find a solution to this war, create a peace to this war. But I think peace is the end game that will come from the strategy of disengagement, taking U.S. forces off Eastern European bases, taking U.S. money out of Ukraine, and stopping the sharing of intelligence information, and stopping the running and management of the war from Germany, which was exposed via that New York Times article that came out a week or two ago. That is the only solution. That's the American first solution. That is the good Trump instincts that he had when he was campaigning, most of which has been disregarded. We're just seeing the same kind of status quo flow of weapons, munitions, and money into Ukraine, and the populist Republicans aren't making a big enough scene about it. They're not telling Trump that he's in the wrong for this, for the most part. So that's a big mistake, and I just hope for a quick solution and end to this war that stops the fighting, stops the conscription on both sides, stops the suppression of civil liberties, and stops all the madness that the U.S. is complicit in and has been even since the 90s when the first wave of NATO expansion begun. There were so many off-ramps to this catastrophe, but now we're living through the worst stage of it. But there is another worse stage that could be avoided if we disengage, and that's nuclear winter, and that's not what we want. So let me know in the comments below, what do you think? Has Trump inherited this war and abandoned America First principles? Let me know down below. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out. I'll see you guys later.